Hi, my name's Emery Orlando. For the past few years, I've been living with chronic Lyme disease. And I am also currently being treated for it because I wasn't properly diagnosed until last January. So why is that? Well, according to the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and the IDSA, the Infectious Disease Society of America, Lyme disease cannot be chronic, and therefore it's really hard to find a doctor who will not only diagnose you but properly treat you, and it's also hard to find an insurance company to cover your treatments. So I'm here to prove today that my disease is real, and also to state how I believe the government should step in so Lyme doesn't end up killing my bud. Okay, so what is Lyme disease exactly? Well, first of all, most people don't even know how to say it. It's Lyme disease, not Lyme's disease. There is no S. And also, Lyme disease is a bacterial infection called Borrelia. Borrelia is a spirochete, which means it's a spiral shape. Because of that spiral shape, it can pretty much get itself into any system of the body. And that is why in Lyme patients, their symptoms range all over the place, from physical to neurological. And because of that, Lyme disease is often known as the great imitator because it can practically mimic any disease, from chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, MS, ALS, ADHD, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, depression, anxiety, you name it, Lyme can imitate it. And what people do know about Lyme is that it comes from a tick bite, which is true. It does come from a tick bite. But what most people don't know is that it can also be contracted sexually, and it can be given from mother to fetus. And with those people who got bit by ticks, only about 40% of them actually remember getting a bullseye rash and getting bit. I myself do not remember getting bit or having any type of a bullseye rash on my body. Now in 2014, the CDC upped the amount of cases from 30,000 a year to more than 300,000 cases per year. And today, Lyme is popping up in states that it has never been before. It's not only in the East Coast and Lyme, Connecticut, it can be found in Texas, California, Illinois. Now, what is the big deal about Lyme? Why am I making this video? Well, there is a lot of corruption within the testing and the treatment of Lyme disease. And I'm here to say what I think the government should do about that. So testing. The CDC recommends 2 tests be done, the ELISA test and the Western blot test. Now what's the big deal about these tests? Well, according to a study done at Johns Hopkins, about 52% of patients with Lyme came back with a false negative. And under the Western blot, about 50% of patients with chronic Lyme came back with an indeterminate. Why are these tests so inaccurate? There's more than 300 strands of Lyme, and the CDC is testing for about 2 of those strands. And that's what our government is using to test for this epidemic. Thankfully, there are much more accurate tests out there than those recommended by the CDC. There's the Armin test, which is 200 times more accurate than the ELISA test, and IGeneX, which tests for the CD57 levels. And that is something that can only be lowered by the Lyme bacteria. That test was actually done on me to diagnose me with my Lyme disease. Now, this is quite an injustice within the testing of a nationwide epidemic. That is why I propose there be a law put in place by the legislative branch stating that anytime a doctor is presented with a case that could be an imitator of Lyme, that they must test them with an accurate Lyme test. Because you don't want people walking around with Lyme and not know it for 5, 10, 20 years. People need to stop treating the symptoms they think is Lyme, like ADHD and depression, and start treating what they actually have, which is Lyme disease. Now, sadly, treatment can be even harder to deal with than the testing. In the past 3 years, cases have risen to over 300,000 per year, and yet the guidelines to treat Lyme have not changed since 2006. The IDSA guidelines state that when someone is contracted with Lyme disease, they should be put on antibiotics for about 2 to 4 weeks. That's all they need to be healed. And that would be true if someone, say, would get bit, get tested right away, and get those antibiotics. They most likely would get treated and would heal. But the longer Lyme stays in your body, the harder it is to treat. So if you, say, get bit when you're 6 and you don't find out until you're 26 that you have Lyme disease, it's going to take a lot longer than 2 to 4 weeks to get rid of. That's the difference between recent Lyme and chronic Lyme, the time between the bite and the treatment. Now, why are these the guidelines to treat Lyme? Well, that's because the IDSA does not recognize Lyme as being a chronic disease, even though there has been studies done that have found biofilms on the Borrelia bacteria, and a biofilm is a marker for any chronic disease. Now, many doctors are pretty reluctant to treat patients past those 2 to 4 weeks of antibiotics because of these guidelines. There have even been doctors suspended from their practices for treating chronic Lyme effectively. And they were suspended because they were pretty much told on to the medical boards, not by patients who didn't like their treatments, but actually by insurance companies who didn't want these doctors costing them a lot of money. This is where the judicial branch can come into play. If one of those lawsuits ever reached the Supreme Court, they need to be on the side of effectively treating Lyme patients. And how can they do that? By simply letting the research of Lyme speak for itself. And the fact that the IDSA guidelines are out of date and prevent patients from effectively being healed. Now, as of right now, there is an updated process to the IDSA guidelines for Lyme, and that will be released in the spring of 2018. But unless those guidelines state a way to treat chronic Lyme, there really isn't any progress being made. That's why I propose that the executive branch put more money into the CDC's research for effective testing and treatment of Lyme, so that the best information about this disease is presented to the people. For the past 2 years, Lyme has completely turned my life upside down. I thought I had mono, I thought I had early onset Alzheimer's, I thought I had some neurological problem. I've gone to get multiple MRIs, countless blood tests, all to figure out what was going on with me that I just couldn't describe. It's completely warped my high school experience. It's given me all types of social anxieties and depression. I couldn't even go to one football game my senior year because I was just much too tired on Friday nights. Now, Lyme is affecting hundreds of thousands of people just like this, and some don't even know they have it. But it doesn't have to be like this, with the right application of the right information. So I hope this video taught you something about Lyme. For those of you who have Lyme disease and are fighting with me against it, I hope that you find a treatment that is working for you so Lyme doesn't kill your vibe.